We're live, I think, are we? Yeah, we live, John?
We are, Kevin. Yep.
All right, thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay in starting this evening. You're very welcome. My name is Kevin Quinn from Tennis Ireland. We're here this evening to talk about a very, I suppose, complex, sensitive, challenging subject in the employees versus independent contractors issue. And basically the new advice, or if you like, I suppose, emphasis that Revenue are putting on tax. So we're delighted to have John and all the team here from Augier to help us with some guidance on this topic. We had hoped that it's in collaboration with Tennis Coach Ireland. So with thanks to Stephen and Peter, we had hoped Peter was going to be able to join me just this evening here to say hello and to welcome all the coaches as well. But unfortunately, a couple of technical gremlins, he hasn't been able to dial in, but hopefully he's on the call. Just from a Tennis Ireland point of view, we're really conscious that this is a really complicated area. We've been trying to and will endeavour to support our clubs and our licensed coaches as best as possible through this issue. We know that there's an impending deadline at the end of January. What I can say about that is that with all the other NGBs, because remember, this issue doesn't just affect sport, it's the NGBs in sport, it's across the arts, the cultural, the charity sector as well. So anywhere really where volunteers and or contractors are working. There is a deadline at the end of January, and speaking with the Federation of Irish Sports, who are closely working with and lobbying with, we are hopeful that by the end of this week we'll have an update, we hope, on a postponement or at least a delay of that date by somewhat. Not guaranteed, but we're more than hopeful that we'll hear something by the end of this week. It's, I suppose, just from our perspective too, Tennis Ireland will be working through this ourselves, so we don't have all the answers. We must, I suppose, call out, though, the fact that this is guidance tonight, and if there's any really key or acute questions that either a club or a coach feels they may have, we do advise you to get your own advice, because it's, as you'll see in terms of the examples that we do later, and thank you for all the questions we received, it's a complicated area, and there's nuances and differences between every club, every coach in a lot of different situations. So thanks for joining us. And we will also be recording this session and making it available afterwards, because I know particularly a number of coaches are working, so they can't really get into this. But it will be available afterwards, and we'll also make the questions and the answers available afterwards as well as guidance for everybody. So again, thanks a million for joining us tonight. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, John, for your expertise in this challenging area. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Kevin, for that introduction. By way of background, my name is John Perry. I'm a tax partner here at Augier. Augier are the legal partners to the Federation of Irish Sport, and we've been working with them on this. What I plan to do is to go through what the change is, to provide some examples that the Revenue have produced. They're not particularly helpful from a Tennis Ireland or Tennis Club Ireland point of view, but we'll talk through those examples and try and share some insights. And then we'll try and address some of the questions that have come through. And there is a Q&A function that if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in there and we'll try and address those. If not in the area that we have allotted, we'll try and update the slide deck with those answers and circulate them after the call. So going through my slide.
Oh, have we lost John?
Hello, sorry about that. I'm back.
Welcome back, John.
Continue. Sorry, I was just going to put on my slide deck here now, and we'll run through the slides now that I'll circulate afterwards. So, by way of background, this Karshan case summary, which some of you probably referred to as the Domino's case, came back in 2018. Domino's classified their drivers as self-employed. Revenue have argued that, in fact, that they were employees for tax purposes, and we'll discuss what the implications of that is. But since 2008, the Domino's have gone through each of the review stages, including the High Court, ultimately to the Supreme Court, to get a ruling in this. So the point being really that both the Irish Revenue and the taxpayer have invested a lot to get to an answer for this, because it was not particularly clear in prior years. So the Supreme Court was tasked with determining whether people were engaged under a contract of service. You'll see this as a term used as an employee, or for services, which are contractors. And the judgment effectively established a 5-point test, which can be applied to your own contractors to see whether they are employees or not. And it supersedes any written contracts that there may be. Moving on to the next slide. This is just an overview again of the different decisions that have come, including the appeals court. So again, the Supreme Court has made a judgment that we all have to focus on, but you may wonder why this has only just come, and the deadline being the end of January, but it's been in the works for quite a while. So the potential implications. So as an employer, you're liable to pay PRSI, up to 11.25% for Class A, payroll taxes, and USC. You may be required to pay for annual leave, because this is not just a tax issue, it's an employment law issue. You're required to enroll the employees in the auto-enrollment pension scheme. There is a minimum threshold for that of 20,000. You may be liable for employee benefits such as overtime, sick pay, and health insurance. And the point of all that is just to say that classifying someone as an employee for tax, although it may be burdensome in itself, there is other implications that you need to consider that may make it even more burdensome. For the employee, if you're considered a employee, you have to pay payroll taxes, obviously. You have to also pay PRSI, which is 4.2%, and you have to pay USC. Now, what are the 5 tests that we're going to run through in the examples? So effectively, the Supreme Court in their ruling said, 1, does the contract involve an exchange of a wage or remuneration for the work? So generally, obviously, this is yes, where somebody's being paid. 2, is the worker agreeing to provide his own services rather than the services of third party? So this is to do with control. Can you provide somebody else in your place to provide that service? And we'll go through some examples. Does the employer exercise sufficient control over the individual to render the agreement capable of being an employment relationship? And 4th, we'll go through those 3 questions, but basically they're a gateway. And if you answer yes to all those 3, you then go on to question 4. If you answer no, you don't have to go any further. Are the terms of the contract viewed in light of the actual working arrangements consistent with employment rather than self-employment? This is really where most people spend most of their detail looking at the circumstances of a contractor to see whether actually substance over form is that they're an employee. And then question 5, finally, is there anything in the relevant legislation regime that requires the court to adjust the previous conclusions? This really is only referring to legislation that requires an office holder to be considered an employee. So if you're a director of an organization, because you're considered an office holder, you would be considered an employee, and those tax consequences apply to you. So as I mentioned, the Justice Murray said, through those 5 questions, I think the right approach is to view the first 3 questions I have just identified as a filter in the form of the preliminary questions, which if any one is answered negatively means that can be no contract of employment, so not an employee. But if all are answered affirmatively, allow the integration of all of the facts and circumstances to ascertain the true nature of the relationship. So moving on to question 4 there. So the revenue disclosure opportunity really is a time-limited disclosure, allowing employers to regularize their payroll taxes for 24 and 25 without interest and penalties. where genuine misclassification has occurred. And that option is available to the 30th of January in 11 days' time. Now, to Kevin's point, we have heard but haven't confirmed that there may be an extension to this, but at the moment that is not the case. What Revenue have said is that they're aware that some businesses are reviewing the status of their employees and contractors, and they're concerned they will not have fully completed the review by the 30th of January. So Revenue suggests that they've clarified for those businesses that they're preparing disclosures that, if any, after the submission deadline, there's a need to amend the details of a disclosure which has already been submitted. Revenue will accept those amendments in accordance with the code. What the Revenue is doing there really is to provide flexibility. So if you make a submission on a best case effort and you find that there is information that comes to light after the deadline, that necessarily won't make the disclosure to be disqualified. Now, this is probably important for people to apply the tests to their own situations or their own contractors. So the characteristics of employees that the Revenue look at are being under direction or control of an employer, supplying labour only and receiving a fixed wage, being unable to subcontract their work, not supplying equipment other than small tools, having no opportunity for profit from personal efficiency, working set hours with potential entitlement to sick pay, being paid expenses, and working for one business with no ability to work for any other business. All of these are considered together. There's no one that will make you an employee. It's taken over an overall consideration. For independent contractors to confer supplies. So does the individual own their own business? Does the individual take on financial risk of the work? Does the individual manage their own work and investment? Is there an ability to hire others to complete the work or ability to contract out work? Is there work for multiple clients? Is there a set price for work? Is there provision of their own insurance? Are they controlling their work hours and work methodology and providing materials and equipment to enable them to complete their work? Again, not one is indicative, but all are taken into consideration. One thing to point out is the use of companies. So many contractors will have set up their own companies and invoice. And what Revenue have said, that's perfectly acceptable to provide their services through a company. The personal service company is where an individual contractor provides their services through a limited company, but it's incorporated in residence and taxed in Ireland. And they have confirmed they will not look through the corporate veil unless there's has been pierced or is ineffective. So really what they're saying there is that the company itself should apply PRSI and PAYE to the employee and also file VAT and corporation tax returns. And the company in turn will just invoice the employer for the services. Again, as I mentioned, this is not just a tax question. There are implications for employment law. So you must consider, if you decide that a contractor is now considered an employee, you have to look at employment law to see whether they are can avail of unfair dismissal claims, if there's any holiday pay liabilities, minimum wage issues, claims for any backdated employment rights, any working time obligations, notice payments, and redundancy entitlements. So the key takeaways for employers, I think, is that the Department of Social Protection, Revenue Commissioners, and the Workplace Protection Commission have incorporated the Supreme Court ruling into their work practices. Each of those look after different areas. Social protection obviously is to do with PRSI and being able to avail of certain benefits from the state once you've paid those contributions. Revenue being tax, and then the Workplace Commission being to do with employment. Revenue would see that the tax employment law tests are now aligned, and they suggest that everybody review all their contractor arrangements, that they are concerned that the misclassification can lead to major tax and PRSI liabilities for individuals and employers that to use the revenue disclosure window if they feel it's appropriate, and obviously obtain professional advice if you are uncertain. One of the questions we got is to do with the calculation of the liabilities and the settlement. So there is a simplified approach. So you would pay 20% on the gross amount paid on income tax. So one of the questions was whether we knew the tax position of the individual if we didn't have their tax certs. So the revenue agreed that you can deduct 20%. Also, USC, there's different rates depending on individual circumstances. So they've suggested a 3.5% blended rate on the gross amount paid. For PRSI, it's slightly more complicated and it's on an actual basis. For most employees that earn more than €352 a week would be classified as Class A, and they have to pay 4.2% to the revenue. And with the employer, it's up to 11.15%, again, depending on the weekly earnings, from €350 upwards. That information is available on revenues and social protection websites if you need more information. So we're coming into the examples. Now, Revenue have provided 19 examples in their documentation and their manual of varying degrees of helpfulness. We've picked out just 5. We will try and apply those to the particular circumstances in the audience that we're talking to today, but you'll appreciate the first examples that I'm using are the revenue examples, and it's really just to show if you're making a submission, what they would expect in the submission. And so you'll bear with me as they may seem irrelevant to the sporting world, but that's the basis that we're doing it. So Appendix 1, Example 1, a construction company, SECO, engages a general labourer, James, to work on a site. So this could potentially be a coach. James is paid an hourly rate. James cannot send someone else in his place. And the company sees foreman determines the hours that will be worked. James does not supply any equipment and supplies labour only. So this is an example of if you were making a submission to the revenue and you wanted to regularize a contractor's position as an employee, they would look to see that you've addressed these 5 questions and the basis that you are making the submission. One of the questions that comes up that I've been asked before by other national governing bodies is, what information do you submit? We're recommending it's only those contractors that you now feel are employees that you'd make a submission on. So you don't have to include every person that you would engage with, only those that you wish to make a disclosure on. So again, in this example, we've gone through the facts. So yes to question 1, yes to question 2, yes to question 3, the control, because the foreman can determine how, where, and what the work is done. Now, question 4 was where most analysis is done. So the contract of engagement is drafted as a self-employment contract with payments made to James reported through the RCT portal. That's just a withholding tax portal. The facts of the case do not support this position. In addition to the facts detailed under questions 1 to 3, James cannot profit beyond his set hourly rate. He's told what he's being paid for by the foreman, uses tools supplied by the company as an insured similar to an employee. Question 5, there's no legislative context. So therefore, the conclusion is James is an employee and PAY should be applied by the company. Now, I have 4 other examples, 2 of which are self-employed people, so that to just balance that out. But the next one, again, is for another self-employed person, again, provided by the revenue themselves, very similar. And again, there is 19 examples that you can look at to see if it applies to your particular circumstances. But Richard works as a plasterer for BCO, a building company, on a labour-only basis. He's paid on a daily basis. He takes his instructions from the site foreman, and Richard is not free to provide someone else to perform his duties. So again, as you can imagine, because of the questions that we've answered yes to, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that he is an employee and PAYE should be applied. Now, to provide some balance, we'll look at a self-employed basis. So Peter works as an electrician for BECO. He supplies labour, materials, and his own tools. He's paid a set fee to wire each house and what house to wire next from the site foreman, and there are no Peter has been contracted to do. So again, there is a payment. So yes, the question 1. Question 2, there's no restriction on who does the work. So it's not a personal service. And because we've answered no to the second question, one of the first 3, there's actually no reason to continue on with the other questions. And James, or Peter in this case, should be self-employed. That could be applied, for example, if you were a coach and you weren't providing a personal service, but actually you were providing a service that you received an hourly rate for, but you could supply somebody else. You were deciding how that training happened. And we'll talk a little bit about those examples in a bit more detail when we go through the questions. And then revenues, another example of revenues example is 4. Andrew, an actor, was engaged to provide a workshop to transition year students in the secondary school. He provides his own material, his own insurance, can send a substitute to carry out these duties. He informs the school of the rates and his availability, and he's free to take up similar work at the same time with other businesses. I think this is helpful because I know there's a number of circumstances we've been asked about in the tennis world where coaching or developing the game has been contracted out, and you might provide to schools or clubs, and you do it in your own way, and you can provide somebody else, and you provide the rates and your availability. So again, you'll see this format that's been taken by revenue, which you could take on your submission if you wanted to defend it, if you were under a revenue audit of why a person be self-employed. Just to be clear there on question 2, Andrew can make a substitution. Number 3, control. While this test does not need to be examined, commentary is included for the completeness. Andrew is not directed by the school as to what work should be done or how it should be done, as the workshops are carried out during school hours, and given the nature of the work, the workshops must be carried out in the school premises. There is a written agreement, but it doesn't specify whether it's a contract for employment. However, applying the framework such that 2 of the filter questions are answered negatively, it's a contract for service and not an employee. Now, the last example, again, is just really to the question 5 that I mentioned, if you're a director of an organisation. So Rachel is self-employed as a partner in a solicitor's practice and returns her partnership income under self-assessment. She takes a position on a state board appointed by a government minister. Rachel is paid on a session rate basis per half day. The duties of the board members are laid down in statute. Rachel is not free to provide someone else to attend the board meetings, but some duties in preparation for the meeting are carried out by the firm staff. In this case, Rachel is paid a fee. Although she doesn't provide personal service, Rachel cannot send someone else to attend these meetings because she's appointed. Her staff carry out elements of her duties, including research, and she uses the resources of the practice to complete her work. Her access to these resources was one of the requirements for the appointment of the board. Control, the functions of the board are laid down in statute. Rachel has been engaged because of her specialist legal knowledge. As a skilled professional, Rachel is not directed as how to do the work. The number to 2 is no, so this step doesn't need to be considered. Question 4. However, in question 5, board members of state bodies are office holders, and therefore section 112 provides that office holders' income is always taxable as Schedule E, which is employment income, and subject to PAYE. So therefore, Rachel is an office holder. So that's the examples revenue have given us. And as I say, there's 19 in there. We can circulate those after the call. But what we're going to do now for the second half of this call is run through the questions. And just to say as well, again, my colleague Edwina is on the call and she's monitoring the Q&As coming through. So once I've run through these few, she'll run through any additional questions. So feel free to put them in there, and I'll try and be as helpful as I can. So in relation to staffing and roles, for an admin person working 15 to 18 hours per week for the club, working from home some days and some days at the club, if they are being paid each month by the club for hours worked like this, do they class as a subcontractor or employee? Well, you can't be definitive unless you look at the 5 tests that we've gone through. But on the face of it, just to this point, it doesn't matter where your place of work is, if you're working at home or in the club, that's not necessarily a factor. And so we would look for more information. We do have a questionnaire that we send some national government bodies that look for us to provide advice on this. We're happy to share that as well. Those questions are a bit more detailed on the 5-step really to get to the kernel of the position, so that we can advise you. But we can share those if you want to ask those questions of yourself. So does this type of work impact on whether or not it's a contractor or FTE? For example, coaching one-to-one or group, or for club tennis administration. So I'd say, again, it's very specific to the person or the contractor. If, for example, a club allows their facility to be used, and a coach is coaching one-to-one, and the club is not employing that person to do the coaching, it's the tennis person is getting coached and they're paying the coach directly, that's something that's outside and of the club, and therefore they're not necessarily an employee. Club tennis administration, again, I know there's obviously people who work full-time, but there's also a lot of voluntary people, and they may just get a stipend for helping out on particular occasions. And you have to look at these specific examples. Unfortunately, Revenue have said that their position is really that most people who receive a wage, they're going to see them as an employee unless you can state otherwise. And there is no de minimis amount at the moment. We have suggested there should be, but at the moment there's no de minimis amount. So they have even given examples of transition year students who might come in and help on a camp, and get a small amount of money for helping out in that camp. Revenue would see them as employees. On status and the 5-point framework. So if a coach is coaching a number of clubs and doing their own tax return each year, etc., does this mean that their self-employed status is confirmed and they're not an employee of any clubs themselves? So the fact that you submit your own tax return isn't in of itself doesn't make you self-employed. And I'll come on to the situations where you may have submitted a return and then you're considered an employee, and the complications of that. But working for a number of clubs is one of those fact patterns that is helpful to show you're self-employed. Now, you can have multiple employments. So you could, for argument's sake, be an administrator in a club and be working for the club, and then also be a coach. And you could either be an employee for both or be an employee for one and not the other. So there isn't a one size fits all in these cases, and you have to look at each particular thing, unfortunately. I will come back to the tax return, but effectively, in short, the Revenue don't want anybody to be double taxed. So for 2024, if you've submitted a tax return, there should be credit available against taxes paid. Now, there's some questions about how that will mechanically work. And then 2025, they won't have been submitted yet. And the Revenue asks that you don't, if you are considered an employee for part of your income, you don't include that in your Form 11. So what is Revenue's default position? Are coaches employees? Revenue would say they don't have a default position, that they would look at all the facts and circumstances. However, they do say in their guidance that they would expect people working for a company, unless they can show that they are self-employed by having other contracts and other work and going through those 5 tests, that they would be employees. So the onus, it is self-assessment. It would be on the onus on the employer in the first instance to make a decision. But if the coaches feel that they can defend that, they've the perfect right to do that. And we are aware of a number of organizations who are taking a more strict approach to this and would defend positions than maybe some of the early adopters of this. So I'm sure many of you will be aware there's other organizations that have gone into revenue, have already made submissions and have declared people as employees. There's others, NGBs, who feel that they have a very strong argument to say that they're not employees and are arguing that and will defend that if they're audited. And I can share more details of that if people want to discuss that with me. What specific factors will revenue look at when applying the 5-point framework to the tennis clubs? So again, I think it really is around question 4, all around the circumstances of employment. So they're looking at the entire factual matrix of the relationship between the business and the worker. So can you identify features of the relationship which are consistent with employment or self-employed, and what weight is given to each of those? Is there an actual contract itself interpreted within the light of the factual matrix? So rather than just having a contract to say you're self-employed, is there anything in the manner in which the work is done that shows the reality on the ground that it is a self-employed working arrangement? So going back to that question there in the first, if you're employed or you work for a number of clubs, that's a helpful fact that you can argue that you're self-employed. So for tennis clubs, I think what you have to look at again is the specific circumstances, and it really depends from I say person, but it could be groups of people if you like. So if you have administration people and you try and use all of them, or particular umpires, for example, how do you treat them? And hopefully a lot of those will come into the self-employed bracket. If the club owns courts and allocate time to coaching, how can you control over the coaching to be proved to revenue? Specific wording in a clause in a contract, or can it be proven? So again, as we've kind of addressed, it's a number of facts. A contract alone isn't sufficient if the facts don't back that up, but if the facts do, it's helpful to do it. I've looked at the detailed revenue guidelines and the scenarios provided by revenue. It strikes me that apart from being able to delegate work, coaches fall into the contractor category. If we were to amend the contract to allow them to delegate, could we argue our case successfully in the case of a revenue audit? Well, you potentially could. You could change the contracts, but it won't be just taken on that alone. They would actually probably ask, show me an example of where you actually have put somebody else in to do your job, or do you currently employ a number of people to do that role for you? We have a number of coaches that have different profiles. How are these viewed? So this is a very interesting one because it deals with people who are not residents of the state. So coaches that are resident in Northern Ireland and have other clients. So I'll just drop down to the bottom point there, foreign nationals. So this is really meaning people in double taxation agreement countries, which Ireland has 75 with, but Northern Ireland currently be seen as part of the UK and having reciprocal arrangements with the Irish Revenue. If you are in Ireland for less than 30 days a year providing those services, you are not subject to PAYE as an employee. If you're in Ireland between 30 and 183 days, you may be able to get an exclusion order from the revenue. So basically, you would write to the revenue to say, I'm Northern Ireland resident. I work for approximately these amount of days in Ireland providing these services, but I recognise that income in the UK in my own tax return. So therefore, payroll taxes shouldn't apply in Ireland. And the revenue will provide you a confirmation of that. If you're over 183 days, you're effectively becoming resident in Ireland. So that's where the days come from. And that protection is for treaty countries. If you're delivering it from a non-treaty country, that safe harbour test mightn't apply. Coaches that are resident in Northern Ireland but only work for one club. Again, you still could be self-employed because even though you might be working for one club, for the reasons I mentioned about the days in Ireland, but also just because you work for one club, although that fact in its own may suggest that you're an employee, other circumstances may be taken into consideration that actually you're self-employed. And that could be, for example, a physio who works for one club, but they have their own practice, their own and their own expertise. Nobody tells them what to do, but the club will send their players to this particular physio. So again, circumstances will dictate. Coaches that live in the Republic of Ireland and are paid on hours attended and a monthly fee for administration. Again, unless you can show that you are providing similar services to others, or you can provide somebody else, or that the club doesn't have that control over you, you're most likely an employee. Coaches that live in the Republic of Ireland and are paid on hours attended only. Again, just, I keep repeating myself about the facts, but on that fact alone, you'd be an employee. You're just getting paid on an hourly basis. So the assumption would be you're an employee. The club runs several coaching courses and controls the hours that the coaches work. The coaches have their own insurance, but the club will supply the equipment. Where do we stand? Well, again, if I go back to the revenue example that we used, where the person was self-employed, they went to the school, they provided lessons transition year. So there's an argument to be there because you have your own insurance. You could potentially provide somebody else to do it for you on your own behalf. Nobody's telling you how to deliver that course, that you could potentially be self-employed. So you'd have to take a position on that. If it was that you felt that you were a contractor, you don't need to take avail of the settlement to the revenue. You don't need to disclose anything to the revenue. But if you felt that you were an employee and you want to regularize those affairs, you would make a submission. Will revenue expect clubs to treat private coaching by club coaches, one, if the coach is an employee, or two, is coach is a contractor? So a lot of the similar questions coming up here. I can't give you a definitive answer, but if the club is not paying the club coaches, that's a good fact pattern. If they are paying the coaches, well, then we'd look at the other facts, such as, does the coach provide that for other clubs as well? A coach engaged by a club member for one-on-one coaching, not paid or booked through the club. So we've touched on that. Presumably, private coaching would have to be included as part of the POI settlement if we were to make them employees. No, not necessarily. So you can have different types of work provided and have different treatments. So as I was saying earlier, you could be an employee for one particular piece of work and be a self-employed for another. Just because you're an employee doesn't mean that everything that you provide is PAYE-able. Now, if you do decide a coach is an employee and they only work for you and they are doing one-on-one coaching, you would then probably include that because you're paying them to do that one-on-one coaching. But as I say, there is circumstances that may not be as clear-cut. So the financials and retrospective tax, which is a difficult area, but if a coach is deemed an employee, how do we calculate the tax, etc., when we don't have their tax allowance? So hopefully that slide I provided about the settlements earlier gives you an indication. So you apply the 20% for the income tax, 3.5% for USC, and then you have specific PRSI payments to be made. One thing just to mention is, as an employer, if you do make them employee, you then have to make a PRSI file with the revenue. So you obviously have to pay the tax as part of the settlements, but you also have to set up this PRSI file as well. Could you do a mock-up of the tax calculation for 30K? I think we've worked through that, but if people want to reach out to me separately, I'm happy to help. We are only being made aware of this ruling now. Why are the revenue looking to retrospectively for 2024 and 25? Well, as I mentioned, it actually started in 2018. The ruling came in 2024, so they're trying to give an opportunity to regularize their affairs. Appreciate it seems unfair. You have to see that revenue aren't looking at particular industries. What they're trying to do is catch people who are trying to avoid paying tax. Unfortunately, sports governing bodies and their contractors have been caught in this. I think, from what Revenue has said about the extension of the deadline and the flexibility, I don't think there'll be particular focus on audits in this area. And so it's the reason 24 and 25 is taken is because Revenue would feel that they've clarified their position in those 2 years. If contracted coaches are deemed employees for 24 and 25, is there potentially a very heavy financial burden on the clubs that they're not able to pay? And how do we deal this with Revenue? So yes, they will have to pay this tax over. When you're making a submission as an employer, you have to submit the details, but you also have to pay the tax before the 30th of January as it stands. If the amount is too burden, notify them when you're making submission that you and what that payment plan might look like, that you will pay X over the following months or years, as the case may be, and they will agree with that or not. For contracted coaches that no longer work for us but may be deemed as employees when working for us in 24 and 25, do we have to make a submission for them? Yes, you do, and you just notify as part of the submission details of when they stop being an employee. For contracted coaches deemed as employees under this ruling, should we move them to employees now from the 1st of January 2026? Yes, so either you do it from the date that they became employees, is if it's 24 or 25, or going forward, you would notify Revenue of that case. How to manage the challenge of small volunteer organisation that changes every year, manage employees, and the implications of that, what supports are available. So I think Revenue have recognised that you may not be able to have all that information to hand. So they're willing you to make a submission on best efforts. They do have a payment plan if required for clubs and organisations. Revenue also, if you make a submission, you can make a expression of doubt. So what that does is gives you a bit of protection that you're making a submission. You're saying that this is what you believe in your best efforts, the case may be, but you are uncertain on particular contractors, if you like, and they will make a judgment. Now, people tend not to do that because, as you can imagine, Revenue are going to take a very prudent approach. And if you ask them, do you think this person's a contractor? In all likelihood, they'll probably say they are an employee, but it's up to people to do that if they wish. Could Tennis Ireland support the clubs by providing employee and contract template? Well, I know, I'm not sure about Tennis Ireland, but I know Osier Ireland, we don't provide sample templates. Just because if they get amended and changed, that could cause issues and more further confusion. But we are happy to support organisations if they would like to look at the contracts, and an employment lawyer can look at them. That's not a problem. Suspected concerns from coaches. So timings of filings, reassurance for those who have already filed their Form 11s for 2024. As I say, Revenue said they don't want double taxation. Now, the complexity about this is if you've submitted your Form 11 and you've paid tax, and then the employer, say Tennis Ireland in this instance, then makes a submission and also pay tax. What's happened there is there's double taxation. So then the question is, who recoups that tax? So the Revenue haven't clearly stated how that would work in practice. So it's important to discuss, I think, with people how that will work in practice. And then 2025 taxes, they shouldn't be filed to 2026. And Revenue have asked if there's income that will be treated by the employer as payroll taxes will apply, not to include that in your Form 11, so that problem doesn't arise. Independence, what's the best advice for those who do not want to be an employee and want freedom to work across multiple clubs? To gather the evidence to show that you do that. Certainly, if you've got a company, they won't break the seal of that corporate veil, but again, they'll still look to the company that is deducting payroll taxes paid to an employee. If you're able to show that you meet those 5 tests, I would document that in the examples that we've shown in the 5, just in case there's an audit, you can provide that evidence. Again, taxes in Ireland is under self-assessment, so you can take that approach if you wish. Liabilities, if they didn't pay taxes to date, will they get a bill from the Revenue for this? So if, for example, you're a contractor and the person you are contracting with, say Tennis Ireland, agrees with that, there's nothing further to be done. There's no submissions to be made. There'll be no tax assessments raised. You just should document and have the documents to hand in case you're audited at a later stage to show that you are an independent contractor. If a submission is made, it is the employers required to make the payment of the taxes, withhold those taxes that should have been paid in 24 and 25. So it's the employer's responsibility. It is then the employer's decision about how they recoup that tax, if at all. Again, the Revenue haven't given any guidance around that. So that kind of brings me to the end of the questions I received before the presentation. I might bring Edwina in now just to see if any questions have come through on the Q&A and see if we can address those as well.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for that, John. Yes, we have a number of questions, so we'll do our best to get through all of them as there are quite a few. But the first one is, would head coaches or directors of tennis subcontracting to other coaches at an agreed hourly rate then be regarded as employers and therefore have the same obligations, aside from the obligation that the clubs may be under on a standalone basis?
That's a very good question. So the same test would apply in that scenario. And the people you're subcontracting, you would then decide whether you are telling them what to do. Can they provide somebody else? Do the facts, allow them to profit from it? If they're more efficient. So you would have to apply the same scenarios. I haven't seen a submission on that basis, though, to date. Shall we put it that way? But the same tests would apply.
Great, thank you. And then the next one is, if a coach only delivers a small number of hours, for example, 4 per week, would they be considered as employed?
So all things being equal, yes, because just a de minimis amount doesn't apply. And Revenue actually say, even if you worked for 1 day, they talk about seasonal workers, they technically are still employees. It's not the amount of time that is dictates whether you're employed or not.
Great. And then the next one is in the context of junior coaching, which this individual says is most of the coaching that's given. And the question is, do clubs control the hours, or are clubs themselves mostly controlled by the school hours? I don't know if this is one for us or maybe Tennis Ireland.
Yeah, I think from my understanding, programs are set up in the schools, for example. They are contracted where coaches would come in and deliver the course, that wouldn't necessarily make them employees, though. I think Tennis Ireland in that situation is organising growth of the sport and providing the opportunity for coaches to provide these coaching. And if they were providing services to other organisations, other schools, other clubs, they technically could be self-employed. But again, it's not something that you can use a blanket to say that that's perfectly fine. But it's not to say that you would be employed just because you're asked by Tennis Ireland to provide a course in a particular school or club.
Okay, great. And then the next one is, surely Revenue will demand clubs tell them who is paid as a self-employed coach. Isn't that in the sports exemption to taxes?
So to the first point of that question, it's entitled Revenue are absolutely able to ask of individuals about their tax returns. It's on a self-assessment basis. You get audited. You have to provide the documentation. That could be up to 6 years. They can go back 4 years for asking for information. I'm not. They may well when they open an audit for an employer. So just say we take Tennis Ireland, and they say we're going to. They usually do an inquiry first, and they'll ask general questions. Then they find that if there's something that they want further information on, they'll go to an audit. And the reason that's important is because it's all set out in legislation to do with timelines and information and what they can ask and so on. If they go into audit, they could ask that question. And then you're on, the employer would then be required to show the documentation of why they decided who was an employee and who wasn't. And it goes back to those examples that we have in Revenue. So really that documentation should be in place before the submission's made, or certainly before Revenue decide an audit, because you'll have to defend that. And that's perfectly fine. If you have taken a position and you're willing to defend it, that's absolutely, that there's no problem with that. The sports exemption is slightly different because that's actually for sports people who are employed or who make their living from sport. So maybe like a professional sport, a tennis player. And what that's around is their pension contributions when they retire and get access to tax-free lump sums of their pensions because their careers are shorter. So there's different rules for professional sports people as opposed to a coach who's providing a service.
Great, that is very helpful. And then if a coach is self-employed, what tax responsibility actually lies with the club? Should clubs be asking to see individuals' tax clearance certificates, etc.?
So there's no requirements by the club to get any of that detail, except perhaps details like their tax reference number, or if they're invoicing and they have a VAT number. You will find some organizations, not necessarily in sport, but in the commercial world, they would ask for those tax clearance certificates. But that's more from a governance point of view of the organization or the commercial body, as opposed to a requirement from Revenue.
Okay, great. And then the next question is, what about an administrator doing work from South Africa, for example? Would be pay here what applies? And I think when they mean would be pay here, they mean in Ireland. So what would apply for the South African individual?
So on the assumption that they're only working for the organization and they just happen to be working remotely, that is an Irish job, that is an Irish employment, and payroll taxes would apply. The fact that you're not residents, the rules that I was applying earlier don't necessarily apply because it's a role in Ireland. You just happen to be doing it from a different jurisdiction.
Great. And then there was a follow-up question then as well about expenses and what to do about them. We can't pay civil service rates as we're not companies.
So expenses, vouched expenses are perfectly fine. You don't have to put payroll taxes on them. The reference to the civil service rate is the standard rate applied for vouched expenses. If the payments are in excess of that, they could be considered remuneration, and that excess might be taxable. So if I give an example, if I think the mileage rate for civil service is 25 cents per kilometre, if I suddenly paid a employee €2 per kilometre, I'm effectively disguising remuneration, and they would look to tax that 175 in addition, rather than the 25 cents per kilometre. So voucher expenses, they're okay. They don't have to be payroll taxes applied to them, except if they're in excess of, for unvouched, I should point out. So vouched is literally, you've got a receipt, that's an expense. It's required for the business, that can be paid. If they're unvouched and they're above civil service amounts, that's when you might have a tax liability.
Great. And then just in terms of what clubs need to provide to revenue, this individual is asking that clubs need to be registered with revenue for income tax, CGT, CAT, capital acquisitions tax, and he understands that clubs have to supply constitutions to revenue, I guess the club's constitutions, and confirm their arrangements for coaches. Is that correct?
So different organisations are in different positions, but a lot of organisations in this sector are charities. So that's when they provide the constitution to show, and their charity registered number, because they don't pay income tax or corporation tax because they are classified as a charity. If you're not a charity, the company itself, when it was set up, is required by law to register for tax, corporation tax. The other tax heads come in if they're applicable. So if you're providing vatable services or receiving vatable services, you may have to register for VAT. If you're an employer, you might have to register for income tax to withhold tax. Capital acquisition tax, that doesn't come in if you're a corporate. Again, if you're a sole trader and you're looking at this, you again would need to register for tax, but that generally is a sole trader. You're not a company, so that's your Form 11 that I keep referring to. That's your income tax return. You're self-employed, and that would contain all those tax heads within that one return.
And then what if the coach can use somebody else to provide the service? So on the question of delegation, but only with the particular club's agreement to do so.
I think that's fine in that particular circumstances, because obviously you're providing a service and you get agreements, but the ability to do that. But again, it's one factor of other things that would be looked at. So in its isolation on its own, it's not a determining factor, but it wouldn't stop you from being self-employed if you had to agree the person you're substituting.
Brilliant, thanks. And then the next one is, are people who have full-time employment, for example, teachers, but who coach after work for a fee, also potential employees?
Yes. That's a simple answer. So they give that example in the revenue guidance. So you can have multiple employments.
Great. And then the next one is, what is a situation where both parties, for example, the club and coach, agree that the coaches are contractors? And then there's a follow-up one, which is, are there minimum hours of work and or continuity of service timeframes that are required for a coach to be deemed an employee? So first, whether they both agree that they're contractors, and then minimum hours of work.
So what I would say is no further action is required. You don't need to make a submission to revenue, but you should document evidence in case you're audited. So from both points of view. In relation to the minimum requirements, no, there isn't. So just remind me again, the second part was to do...
Sorry, so are there minimum hours of work and or continuity of service timeframes that are required for a coach to be deemed an employee?
No, to be deemed an employee, but there is minimum requirements for certain payments. So I mentioned PRSI there. So if you earn under €352 a week, the employee doesn't have to pay PRSI. And then there is continuity requirements for certain employment law. So you've worked a certain period, but it's not for tax reasons. That's employment law or Social Security.
Great. And then the next one is, sorry, there's a few here now. So what if the coach doesn't want to be an employee? Can clubs still offer guest one-off coaching sessions, clinics with different coaches, or how would that work out?
Yeah, so I make the fact basis that you're providing services as a self-employed person and come to arrangements with the club to show that is the case. And all the fact pattern. So again, it's not necessary that all contractors are going to be employees now. And so I'd be careful of that. And I wouldn't expect revenue to challenge all these people providing these services, but you just have to be able to defend your position and be comfortable. And the reason I say that is if, for example, the revenue disagree with you, the concession around penalties and interest would no longer apply. And what has happened to date is that some other sports bodies have been very prudent in their approach and made submissions and have treated a lot of people as employees and paid large tax liabilities because they felt that was the thing they wanted to do and that was the position they took. And that obviously has an impact on the people that they are contracting with. Going forward, it may not be the case that they took the correct position, if you like. And that has to be discussed and negotiated between the employer and employee going forward.
Great. And then also on the topic of other sports bodies having made submissions, this individual was saying that they understood that the GAA are further down the road with revenue on this matter of contractor and employees for coaches and referees. Has there been any feedback? Do we know on what the outcome will be?
So I haven't worked with the GAA. I am aware that the big three, as they call it, IRFU and GAA, have all made submissions. But I wasn't involved in those submissions, so I can't say what the response from those have been.
Okay. And then if the coach is considered an employee for their group coaching, the coach can still handle their privates individually, or does that have to be under the same umbrella as that group coaching?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Edwina?
So I think that's where you have your coach and they're considered an employee for their group coaching, but they also still have privates, or they have students who they coach and give lessons to individually. So two separate coaching streams going on. Yeah.
So you can be an employee for the club and self-employed for your out of club activities, if you like. Mm-hmm. That is possible. I assume you'd want to be self-employed for everything, or maybe not. But yeah, you can have two different positions for two different income streams.
Right. And then is it important for the club to record and document the decision made regarding whether the coach is an employee or not?
Sorry, Edwina.
No, that's okay.
I just lost you.
I'll ask it again. So is it important for the club to record and document the decision made as to whether a coach is an employee or not?
Yes. So revenue, to the points made earlier, and I think this is probably a good place to finish up, and we can take other questions and put them into our slide deck. But it is important to document the position you've taken, because if the revenue decide to audit you, you have to provide that evidence to them in a timely fashion. And again, as I say, audits, there are strict deadlines of when you can provide the information. So you're given a window to provide the information, but it may be difficult to try and find this information at a later date. So yes, that should be all documented, even if it's not provided to the revenue at this stage.
Great. Thanks so much. We have a few more questions there, so I think we will put together responses and try to disseminate them to the attendees after this.
Thank you, Edwina.
Great.
John, if I could just to say
Kevin,
thank you very
would
much.
you like to wrap up?
John, can you hear me there okay, I hope? Just to say thank you so much to yourself, to Edwina, to Kristen, to Arthur, to all the team there in Nigeria for putting together the presentation at relatively short notice as well, and answering all the individual questions is great. To ourselves as well, just in Tennis Ireland, with the coaches and clubs we are working through this process too. So we will keep you all posted in terms of how we are getting on, as well as that. And also just to say to Aileen and to Emma, Alison in her own offer, there's a huge amount of work going in on our side too. So understand it's challenging. It's been good as well. We're working, as I said, with Stephen, with Peter in Tennis Coach Ireland. I think, Peter, you were able to join us, were you? Yeah, I think I can see you there.
I was late in, apologies.
Not at all. We can hear you loud and clear. I don't know if you want to send anything to your members in terms of this, but just that we're working well together on this and we will get answers to people.
I'll just say very briefly, Kevin, if I may, that Tennis Ireland have kindly advertised this event as in conjunction with Tennis Coach Ireland, but in reality, Tennis Ireland made all the running on this. So I'd like to thank Kevin and Tennis Ireland on behalf of the coaches for setting this up. It's been, John, you're a fount of knowledge on this subject. I don't know where you keep your brains. You must have an extension somewhere, but thanks very much. That was very informative and a subject that's of great interest to coaches, and thank you for that, and Edwina for dealing with the questions.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I mean, I think we had over 186 attendees, so it's obviously of significant interest, this subject. We'll keep in touch with everybody. Again, thanks, Rogers. This presentation will be available as a recording afterwards for everybody, and we will definitely follow up with the answers too. Good luck, everyone. John, all the Rogers team, thanks a million, and see you again soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.